Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Raw Men. I think we're at episode 81. And today we have a returning guest. We have Karen Garst. She was on with me a couple of years back promoting a book called Women Beyond Belief, Discovering Life Without Religion. And she's since then edited an anthology entitled Women versus Religion, The Case Against Faith and Freedom. And I understand you're retired in 2008. What brought you out of retirement and why did you take on this subject?
Well, what brought me out of retirement was the June 30th, 2014 decision that the U.S. Supreme Court handed down in Burwell v. Hobby Lobby. And Hobby Lobby is a privately held corporation. It's a hobby shop, craft store. And they petitioned and filed suit that they did not feel that they were obligated to provide certain forms of birth control to their female employees under the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. And they cited their religious views prohibited them from doing that. And the court decided in their favor. I was having lunch with a friend of mine who's an author. She said, "You need to write a book." And I said, the only thing I can get excited about is writing against religion. So that's how I got started. I put a book together with 22 women telling their stories from all parts of the world, how they left religion. And then I kind of got interested and started to attend meetings, the Women's Secular Coalition, et cetera, and met great people and was like the two guests we have on today, Dr. Valerie Tirico and Dr. Abby Hafer. And so I decided to do another anthology. And the title of it is Women versus Religion, The Case Against Faith and for Freedom. And I'm going to go through just a little bit of what are the essays in this anthology. And I think it's unfortunate that a lot of reviewers don't like to review anthologies, because the thing about an anthology is you can get so much more than your opinion in there. You can have vastly different points of view with people, totally different backgrounds. And that's what we've done here. Candace Gorham, who's the author of the Ebony Exodus Project. I
love that name.
Yeah, the Ebony Exodus. It's a great book. And she talks about the impact of religion on our psyche. She talks about the basics of mental illness. This is her field. This is what she does, mental health practitioner. And she talks about depression, anxiety, shame, and guilt. So we get a lot of those issues, particularly with people who were in cults or, quiverful, evangelical Christians, etc. Then Lori Wiseman, who's a professor of communications at a top-ranked American university, talks about traditional Judaism. And it's really fascinating. And she calls it an oppressed and isolated minority within an oppressed and isolated minority. So women in Judaism are double minorities and doubly oppressed. Alexis Record, who is a blogger and a frequent book reviewer, she kind of expands on what Candace Gorham does and talks about her experience with accelerated Christian education, which is a very, very conservative curricula that talks about a mother's roles as helper, cook, cleans house, washes and irons clothes. Okay. So she really works with children and how can you break out of what you were taught. And then Dr. Valerie Tirico, who's going to speak today. She's the author of Trusting Doubt, and she's a blogger. And she talks a lot about the biblical writers. What did they say about women? And what did the early Christian writers and authorities say as well? And then we have Heba Cha, who is an ex-Muslim. And this is the first time I've had an ex-Muslim. She is using a pseudonym. She's a Syrian expatriate raised in Aleppo. And she talks about, what it was like before Islam. There were women leaders. Muhammad's wife was a major caravan leader. And there were women who had positions of authority. So that's really, it's not something we usually read about. So it's very good. And then Aruna Pap is the author of Unworthy Creature, a Punjabi's daughter's memoir of honor, shame, and love. She was raised in India, and she tells the most poignant story of when she was a young girl, a neighbor, a young teenage girl is set on fire and immolated. No one comes to her aid. She has shamed the family, therefore she is murdered. And then we have Valerie Wade and Deanna Adams, who are both very active. Valerie's with the Linfield Historical Consulting Society, Consulting Corporation, and Deanna Adams is a blogger at Musings on a Limb. And they break up the impact on African Americans by talking about before the Civil War and then after the Civil War. So they trace it from the goddesses that were female in Africa. So they're, again, oppressed within an oppression. They lose their female goddesses and they come over and they become slaves. Marilyn DeLasia was born in Guatemala. So she's talking about the impact on Hispanic women. And Hypatia Alexandria, and yes, she renamed herself that after a very famous woman. And she works dealing with promoting secular values as well as social, political, and business interests in the U.S. Latino community. And she co-founded the Hispanic American Freethinkers. So you've got two views there of what it's like in the Hispanic Latino community. And then we have Kaylee Marguerite Whalen. She is Digital Strategies and Social Media Manager at the National LGBTQ Task Force. I met her at the conference, Women's Secular Conference, and she talks about the impact of being transgender woman. Then we have Dr. Abby Hafer, who's author of The Not So Intelligent Designer, an amazing book. And she's going to talk about evolution today. And then finally, we have Greta Vosper. She's the author of With or Without God, as well as other books. And she is a minister in Canada, and she's an atheist. And she is an out atheist in her congregation. Now, she finally has gotten some pushback from the national church, and we'll see how that goes. But a very brave woman, as they are all. So those are the span. And today we have Abby and Valerie to talk a little more detail to just kind of entice your readers to maybe buy the book and read all the essays.
Well, who's going to start then?
Well, Abby starts with an A, so she's got to be used to starting. You must have been called on first, so you go first.
Okay, well, I start out my whole essay with I want
to preface this with something.
Go right on. Yes.
You have a PhD in zoology from Oxford. So as we did just before the show, I want to do this again. Homage. All right, go ahead, please.
Right. And so the chapter that I wrote for this book is based originally, the first part is based on a presentation that I now do, which is about the gender binary and the lack of a gender binary in nature. Remember, I've got a PhD in zoology. This is the kind of thing I do for a living. And so I talk about the lack of a gender binary in nature. I posit that the original sex was female. That is to say, when you had the very, very first self-replicating molecule, let's just say it wasn't Adam and Eve. It was Eve. Eve was the very first self-replicating molecule who divided and divided and divided and divided and sometimes had mutations and set out all kinds of different evolutionary lines. And then eventually competition came into being because that's what evolution is about. And at that point, being able to swap genes actually became useful because then if there was a beneficial mutation, then it could be swapped into the rest of the population through gene exchange, i.e. sex. And so the role that males play is basically as genetic mixers. So they speed up evolutionary change very dramatically. So sex is overall a beneficial adaptation sometimes. What it comes down to is that self-replication is actually far more efficient. And obviously you get a clean copy of yourself that way. But on the other hand, if you are losing in a competition, you and your offspring may be better off if you can swap in genes from somebody else. So as I said, this is the role that sex plays. And the role that men play, or that males play in all this, is being a genetic mixer. So it's a very, very important thing. But what this then points out is that because that's all that sex actually is, it means that in nature, there is no one set of gender characteristics or sexual characteristics or anything else. And so I use a lot of examples from nature of animals that do things differently from the way the conservative Christians and the Abrahamic religions say that humans ought to do things. And these Abrahamic religions often base their arguments on their idea of nature. It's often called the argument from nature, which is totally and completely wrong for those of us who actually study nature. So I talk about everything from males that tend eggs and raise chicks, through transsexual fish, which are actually very common. Sometimes they go from male to female. Sometimes they go from female to male. Sometimes they go back and forth depending upon what seems to work best at any given time. And then I go into one creature that actually has 7 sexes. And I go into the fact that there are trios in nature. There are trios for child rearing. There are actually sexual trios as well. So there are many, many different gender roles and sexual stances, I'll put it that way, that animals have in nature. So you can pretty much squash the argument from nature straight off the bat. And so that is how I start my essay, is by basically crushing the gender binary from the standpoint of nature.
Can you help me with this? Because I mean, I remember when as a kid trying to imagine the possibility of a third sex. And how, let's say, an alien organism could possibly have 3 different sexes. Where you would need all 3 to reproduce. I mean, I realize that, mathematically it comes down to let's call it a binary primary, that in order to mix genes, that, really, as long as you have 2, you have enough. Can you explain to me in a very brief, obviously layman terms, how can you have 7?
Okay. The creature that has 7 sexes is a single-celled organism named Tetrahymena. And needless to say, it's one of my favorite organisms. I
knew her in high school, I think.
You may have. Right. Well, she went on to great acclaim. Anyway, so the way that it works is, again, when things are going well, the creature reproduces by self-cloning. But then when times become more difficult, then they will do sexual reproduction, because that does mean that you'll have new genetic possibilities, which may work better in whatever the current tough environment is. So you've got that. Now, as to the 7 sexes, here's the way that it works. This creature, I'll back up. In your cells and my cells, the chromosomes come in pairs. Except for our reproductive cells. So my egg cells and your sperm cells do not have paired chromosomes. They just have a single chromosome from each of the pairs. You with me on this? Okay. So then what happens is that when an egg cell and a sperm cell meet, then the chromosomes get back together again and can be paired. So what happens with these creatures is that they will make 2 reproductive nucleuses, each of which have unpaired chromosomes. And so then one of these creatures will sidle up to another of these creatures, and they will swap one individual unpaired chromosome like this, and then the 2 new unpaired chromosomes will get together like this. And then, as I said, you have a new reproductive nucleus that has paired chromosomes the way the creature is supposed to have. So that's how it works. Now, as for that pretty much works. As for the 7 sexes, the way it works is that, just call them mating types, like mating types 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Mating type 1 can mate with individuals in any of the other 6 mating types. So if you're in mating type 1, then you can mate with types 2 through 7. If you're in mating type 2, you can mate with mating type 1 and mating types 3 through 7, and so on. But what this does, of course, is that it gives them many, many more chances to meet someone with whom they can sexually reproduce, because
This sounds more like a description of class.
what do you mean by class?
Well, who your options are, who you can date.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. It's kind of a question of who you can. But here's the advantage that this has.
Mhm.
Okay, if you're
Now,
thinking
we are
about,
talking about microbes still, right?
we are talking about microbes, yes.
Okay.
Okay, suppose you're trying to date someone and you are a heterosexual male. In the general human population, only 50% of the entire population will be people you might conceivably be interested in, right?
Okay. Yes.
On the other, and the same would go for me, only 50% of the population is going to be available to me. But if there are 7 different sexes, then basically a lot more of the population is open. Basically, instead of having a 50-50 chance of meeting someone of the type you're interested in, you
This
now
sounds like the way that I used to defend other people's sexuality. I remember saying in high school that
yeah.
I don't have an objection to people being gay. I'm like, or bi or whatever. I said if I was bi, that would mean I have a lot better chances of not being lonely on a Saturday night.
You'd
That's
have many more options, and that is what these creatures get. Basically, 85% of the population is then, in principle, available to them because
Now,
they
we want
have
to
7
specify
sexes.
we want to specify something else too, because when we're talking about microbes, a lot of people don't understand it. They maybe don't even know, what haploid means. They don't understand that we're
Right.
not talking about actual sex in the way that multicellular animals do this. I mean, so we're talking about like a pistis, and that it's something that it's almost analogous to sex, not necessarily homologous, right?
Well, now keep in mind there are different kinds of microbes.
Okay.
And with bacteria, they more or less do just a little bit of genetic swapping. But
Okay.
these now, if you want to get technical, these are eukaryotes. These are creatures that have cells that are like our cells.
Okay,
Bacteria have very, very different cells.
if they're eukaryotes, then it kind of negates what I was talking about. If we're just talking about bacteria, then we're talking about a pistis. But otherwise, okay, granted, we can actually have sex in the traditional concept.
Right.
Okay.
Right. That's what I was getting at.
My apologies for interrupting.
No, that's all right. As I said, this was just a little bit of confusion as to, bacteria versus eukaryotes. Yeah, this is a eukaryotic microorganism. For the rest of you, what that simply means is that these creatures have cells that are like our cells.
When I was a kid, they used to define, single-celled animals, and of course, like if you look in the dictionary, it'll describe, that single-celled animals as protists. And in fact, there's no such thing as a single-celled animal because animals are, by definition, multicellular. Not that that matters to most of the people listening. I just wanted to clarify, and I'm done.
Okay, well, you can, but yeah, I mean, protists are weird creatures by our standards. You certainly can have some protists that do photosynthesis, and so you can consider them to having more of sort of a plant lifestyle versus other microorganisms that do not do photosynthesis, which will have more of sort of an animal lifestyle. But you're right; they're single-celled organisms.
I did not,
but not
I did
bacteria.
not mean to further confuse what you
Oh,
were saying.
it's easy to get confused.
Okay. I try to listen to the things that you're saying from the perspective of people that I've talked to that I know don't study any of this stuff. So how
Mhm.
would they? What sort of impressions? And it's certainly the apologists who are determined to misrepresent whatever they hear.
Mhm.
I try to counter whatever misrepresentation they might have tried to derive from that.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
I should probably stop doing that because it really doesn't help the conversation.
But anyway, I'll just say that I start, therefore, as I said, by crushing the argument from nature, but then I go on to say, so this is what sexual reproduction really is. And this then leads male mammals and birds and so on to resort to a bunch of different strategies for trying to persuade females to mate with them. So, there's gift giving, which humans do, but bowerbirds do too. There's showing off, like peacocks do, but humans do that too. That's kind of the idea of having a really nice sports car or something like that. There is rape and trapping females. That's another way of getting your way in this. It's not nice, but keep in mind, evolution is not a moral code.
Yeah, and I was going to say, and this is what mallards do.
That's what mallards do. That's right. So there are many different ways of trying to persuade a female to mate with you. And part of what I'm getting at in all of this is that what the conservative Abrahamic religions try to do is it's a combination of showing off. It's like, having the biggest big brother on the playground. I mean, there really is no bigger big brother than God, so it's like, hey, baby, look who's with me. And so there's showing off. You're also offering a gift, salvation, which is the world's cheapest gift because you don't actually have to give anything and nobody knows if it works. So
it's a get out of Monopoly free card.
It's even better than that. Really, it's not like get out of jail free. It's just like, here's a gift. It costs me
out of
nothing.
Monopoly jail, because you're never going to go to Monopoly jail anyway.
You lost me on that one.
Well, if Monopoly jail is just a game, you have to pretend to even be on it. So I mean, if I give you a get out of Monopoly jail free card, since you're never going to go to Monopoly jail anyway,
right.
Then
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. This is right. Giving me this little card that does absolutely nothing for me. But, you say, hey, baby, I'm giving you this great gift. It's called salvation. Don't you want that? And the other thing, which is the real sort of poison pill in the whole thing, is that it's like, yeah, I'm giving you this great gift called salvation. All you have to do is follow all these rules. And the rules are set to trap females. Suddenly females are put in, or I should not females, because this happens to human women specifically. Human women are suddenly expected to obey all these rules that were made up by men for men's benefit. And we're supposed to think that this is great, that this is a wonderful gift that we're getting. So as I said, that's kind of the thesis of my chapter, and then I go on further and talk about how this plays off in current U.S. politics, where again you will see all kinds of guys talking about how great this is, and they're giving women this wonderful gift, and they pretend to really care about women when what they're actually caring about is power, basically.
I'm in Texas, and when our former governor Rick Perry, I think it was on the day that he signed his 500th execution order, which makes Texas twice as lethal as the next most lethal state. That 500th execution was a woman. He also signed into law the thing that had been famously protested by popular vote, and he overruled it. That we didn't want to have the restrictions on abortion set up so that we could only have like 4 abortion clinics open for the entire state.
Right.
And he signed this horrible restriction on the excuse that it was an honor to women.
Right. This is what they do. Yep.
Such political spin. And this was something that had tens of thousands of women protesting at the state capitol, and he calls this affront to them an honor. So I think I'm echoing what you're saying there.
Right. And I talk about specific instances of this, of men who have had a lot of power and influence, who could have done a lot of good had they chosen to, but instead basically chose to advise people in power to make decisions that were anti-woman. Am I allowed to talk about individuals?
What do you mean, are you allowed?
Just asking.
Watch me try to stop you.
Okay, there is an individual at Princeton University named Robert George. And they wrote the Manhattan Declaration quite a few years ago. And it's basically about how good Christians have to stand up and defend their good values. And it goes on for some pages about, being anti-abortion and being anti-gay and all kinds of other things like this. But my point really is that Robert George has friends in Washington. He knows people on the Supreme Court. He was a spiritual advisor to John Boehner. He is very influential. I believe, he occasionally talked with George W. Bush and the like. So the point is he could have done a lot of good in the world. And instead, he chose to peddle tripe, to basically insist from a Christian standpoint that the thing to do was to be anti-abortion and anti-gay and the like. And they keep doing it. He kept doing it, talking about how women shouldn't, for instance, be forced to have abortions. Well, we're talking about the US where nobody's being forced to have abortions. They are desperately begging to be allowed to choose to have an abortion. And that was totally not the way he framed it, kind of as you were saying about Rick Perry.
At the risk of sounding completely callous, we are a population of in excess of 7 billion people and climbing exponentially that have limited resources. And this is kind of the way that I look at it, is we ought to have these sort of options. And I know that religion wants to promote as many possible souls unto the Lord, but I obviously have to take the hypothetical stance that what if your imaginary friend isn't real?
Right.
We have to bank on maybe the possibility of having used up all of our resources, and then we have gazillions of starving children and no other living organisms on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Right. And then there you are. What are you going to do that when it turns out that your imaginary friend isn't real?
And I also want everybody to think about
nobody is going to, basically nobody's going to save you, that no one is going to come to the rescue. One of the things that I talk about a little bit when I talk about morality is we actually have to figure things out. That's what science does. We have to figure things out. We have to take care of the planet. And crucially, we understand the consequences of our actions. And we really ought to act that way.
I'd like my readers to think about another thought as well, and I thank you for that. But I just throwing this out there, since you're talking about people who had the ear of a number of presidents. We just lost Billy Graham a couple of days ago.
Right.
And I want people to think about having had the ear of the last 4 or 5 presidents. Just think about the last 4 or 5 presidents, and if you had an hour every week to speak to one of these people, what sort of advice would you have given the last 4 or 5 presidents? And imagine what sort of advice Billy Graham and others of his ilk have given. And I'm sorry to sidetrack. Please go ahead.
No, I mean, that I think is a very valuable point, that you have these so-called spiritual advisors who are in many cases giving really bad advice, sometimes downright hateful, in other cases just not terribly useful. And, they could do a lot better. And I think that that's one of the things that we really need to think about is, how can all of this business of spirituality be done better?
I'd just like to add something. This is Karen. I did some research about abortion quite some time ago, and it was very interesting that even the Catholic Church allowed abortion up till 1868. Up to the point of quickening, where you actually felt the fetus move. And it really became a strategy, a political strategy after Roe v. Wade, because there was a race in Iowa And they got out the Catholics to leaflet against this Democrat who was in favor of Roe v. Wade, and they saw it could work. And it's actually called a wedge strategy.
Right.
And there's one, in the 70s, Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority was formed. And there's one article I read that said before the 1973, Jerry Falwell wouldn't have known how to spell abortion. So I think it's very hypocritical. Because they're doing it to simply gain political power. And if it would have been something else, they would have tried that. And the biggest concern I have, you might say, well, gee, women are engineers, women are doing this, maybe we got gender equality. The biggest concern I have is reproductive rights. And we saw that Iowa was considering a bill to ban abortion at week 9 or 10, and that would be that would almost be illegalizing abortion, because a woman finds out she's pregnant and then makes a decision and then makes an appointment. It's going to be way after that. So one of my biggest concerns is this issue of reproductive rights. And I think religion, because of its stance on many of these issues, is the biggest cultural barrier to gender equality. I don't think we can get to gender equality if we have people still attacking our reproductive rights.
I have to say something in support of that. I mean, I've always said that if you cite religion as your reason behind any position or policy or action, then you still have not given a reason. That your religion is not enough to warrant any kind of special action. You have to show an actual reason other than your belief.
I've actually come up with something like that. I call it the non-supernatural test for morality, which comes down to exactly what you said. You have to actually talk about your moral code without referencing any supernatural being. And that includes the so-called holy books that are supposedly written by supernatural beings. Because I don't think anybody, even if there are supernatural beings, nobody can actually crawl around in their heads and say, oh, this is what the supernatural being really wants. So if you're going to have a good moral code, your starting point is being able to justify your moral code without referencing the supernatural in any way.
So could you justify that what you're doing would still be moral, even if there was not a God?
Even if there was not a God, exactly. If you can do that, then you're at least on the way to having a good moral code. That's the necessary starting point.
I never considered this, the very thought that I just uttered. It had never crossed my mind before. Can you defend your morality in the absence of God? Isn't that amazing that I never thought of that?
I think Valerie had something to say.
Go for it.
Oh, I love this topic of conversation, both because I focus a great deal on morality, and also because I write extensively about reproductive rights, which I also think are at the very heart of whether women are able to have a wide range of choices in terms of how we live our lives. But so first of all, to back up what Karen said, I actually wrote an article a few years back, if you go to valerietarico.com, titled "When God Was Pro-Choice and Why He Changed His Mind." And it documents that transition pretty clearly as being a reaction to Roe v. Wade. In fact, one of the documents that I cite and that I copied and posted to the web was a set of doctrinal statements from the early 1970s from an array of mainline Christian denominations in Washington state, in which everyone, literally except the Catholics, recognized that the moral considerations in support of abortion access outweighed those against. So talking about the autonomy of families, talking about the well-being of women and children, talking about people being able to get a step out of poverty, and talking about people being able to be spiritually and morally autonomous. So it's been quite a sharp turnaround that I agree was basically cultivated for political purposes, even though there are now many people who have drunk the Kool-Aid and who are true believers when it comes to the idea that a fertilized egg is fully a person.
I was just going to ask, but prior to Roe v. Wade, abortion was illegal. So what was the basis for its being illegal before? Was that not religious grounds?
So the I don't know the answer to that question, kind of what the rationalizations and justifications were. What I can say is, go ahead.
I don't know what the American legal system was thinking, except that, they must have been viewing anything that has the genetic potential to develop into a human being. I'm not going to argue that genetically that is a human, but that's all that it is.
Well, there's a difference. Sorry, there's a difference between being a human and being a person, right? So when we think about the traditional attributes of personhood that give a being, what makes human life uniquely precious? Partly it's just that we're biologically wired to perceive human life as uniquely precious, but partly it's a series of attributes that we care about, the ability to think, the ability to feel, to have feel pleasure and pain, to have preferences and intentions, to be conscious and self-conscious, to value one's own existence, to be able to live in relationship to other beings. So those attributes of personhood are traditionally what our whole, I think Karen can comment on this better than I can, but our whole system of jurisprudence is built around recognizing and protecting the lived experience of sentient beings, and those characteristics are frankly more present in a cat or a dog than they are in a human embryo.
And I've seen many demonstrations of this where people will say, okay, to the evangelical, you have a burning hospital, and in it you've got your human patient that you can save, and then you have your vat of 100 fertilized human embryos, and or 1,000 human embryos. It doesn't really matter how many human embryos versus the actual living human. Which one are you going to save? And of course, every human is going to save that living person. And we also have to remember that how many people, not just, I was going to say people that had births, but let's look at all of the miscarriages,
right,
that statistically happen, before it even qualifies as a fetus.
right.
How many of these things happen? So I mean, like what if you want to attribute God as being in charge of everything, then how many abortions is God responsible for? And that's before we even crack open Numbers, chapter 5.
Right. No, God is the world's busiest abortionist. There are many, many failures of pregnancies that happen long before implantation on the uterine lining. So they don't even really register as pregnancies, but the research has been done. So there are lots and lots of fertilized embryos that fail to implant on the uterine lining. They get washed out with the menstrual fluid. That is the end of them. And if God made every single one of them, as the religious right will claim, that means that God made a human embryo, allowed it to live for a few days, knowing nothing of human experience, and then killed it again.
So how many Einsteins and Madame Curies got washed out with the blood in?
Right.
So the irony is,
and God's responsible for all of that if you're going to take the right-wing viewpoint.
in fact, if you look at statistically, someone did this calculus looking at who statistically the inhabitants of heaven would be if you assume that every one of those fertilized eggs has a soul, and then you think about infant mortality and early childhood mortality throughout human history. And it basically, what you come up with is a set of numbers that would suggest that if you just kind of play out the Christian idea of heaven, or the evangelical idea of heaven, that over 99% of the inhabitants of heaven would be essentially moral automatons who had never been able to make the choice to accept Jesus as their personal savior. And most of them would have never had any sort of sentient experience whatsoever. So I actually wrote about this in an article titled "Why Christian Heaven Would Actually Be Hell," because how in the world would any person want to spend eternity as a sentient being in those conditions?
With a bunch of blastocysts, yes. I mean, seriously, spending your time with blastocysts, not much fun.
I think I read that article, and I've always had a similar idea, because God, to me, I mean, seriously, always, God to me reminded me of the 5-year-old kid Anthony Fremont from the old episodes of The Twilight Zone, where we have this kid who can do anything he wants. He can wish anything into the cornfield. He can make a 3-headed hamster if he wants to. He can turn you into a jack-in-the-box if you think bad thoughts. So going to heaven would mean being trapped in the house of Anthony Fremont forever.
Yikes.
And really, every concept of heaven that Christians have ever given to me has been something that I realize that they clearly haven't thought much about. They've given a lot of thought to hell. All of them seem to have thought quite a lot about how horrible it would be to be in hell, because they've thought about that more. How do I get out of going to heaven is, I think, the reason that they think so much about hell. And for me, I'm being completely honest now. I was 12 years old. I tried to read the Bible, and I was told that it was going to be the Word of God, that it would contain wisdom beyond any human author. And of course, anybody that starts to read the Bible from the beginning realizes very quickly how this is not the word of a superior being. This is definitely the word of inferior beings, very definitely. And so I threw the book across the room in disgust, and I offered a prayer that God had better account for this. He had either better explain all of this atrocity, or he had better explain how the authors of the Bible didn't really know who they were talking about, and so they weren't really talking about him. And in a sense, I can say that prayer was honestly answered, because in all of the years since I made that prayer at 12 years old, I've realized thousands of times how the authors of the Bible clearly had no idea what they were talking about.
Yep.
And every vision of heaven that I've ever heard has been something that I didn't want. And I said at 12 that if God did not meet either of these requirements, then he could not have my soul. I still believed in hell because I was 12. So I thought that I was damning myself if God couldn't accommodate. If God really was the monster that the Bible described, then I wanted nothing to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
Which would suggest that at age 12, you had, to some degree, more of a moral core than I think a lot of adults do, because one of the ugliest aspects of Christianity is the way that people are willing to habituate themselves to that idea of hell, and the idea that as Christians, they could feel perfectly comfortable and blissful for all eternity, knowing that other people are, being tortured for eternity. And in fact, there have been Christian authors through history who have written about the idea that the suffering of the damned in hell was going to only magnify the delight and joy of the saved in heaven.
How can you be of such a mind? I've heard people say this, and I realize, how cruel can you be to think that somebody else being tortured for not buying into the same bullshit that you hold so dear could possibly embolden your belief? That's not possible. It only shows the evil that you can't see for yourself.
But it was necessary. If they hadn't put hell out there, they would never have gotten people to buy into it.
They had to have the stick and the carrot.
Absolutely. Right. And, you look at the history of religion, and I usually say it was all downhill after agriculture, because the hunter-gatherers were much more egalitarian. But you look at civilizations developing and little villages, et cetera, and tribes, and they're fighting each other. What better way to fight somebody to say, my God's better than your God, and I'm safe, you're going to go to hell, I'm going to go to heaven. I think that's the only way you got people to fight each other, was by saying they're wrong. They don't believe in the God. They're all going to hell. Kill them anyway. It doesn't really matter.
It's still happening today, right? I think about jihadis and the fact that it's not necessarily that kind of terrorism is wholly a consequence of religion. There are all kinds of social and cultural factors at play, but certainly that idea that you're going to heaven lowers the threshold.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Do you want to switch to Valerie talking about her essay? I don't know how long you want to go.
I do, because we got a good, I think, half hour from Abby, and I appreciate that. Yeah. We didn't give Valerie much at all.
I
Oh,
would
but I
like to
want to
hear from
spend,
Valerie. Yes.
well, because I could spend the rest of the time asking Abby questions. Abby, it's hard to kind of let you go. Can I ask one quick question before we switch to talking about some of my stuff?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so here it is. I can't wrap my brain around the spread of religion and its ability to sustain itself in human populations without really reverting increasingly to kind of thinking of it as a meta organism that is subject to natural selection and that kind of essentially is either parasitic or symbiotic and kind of hosted in the human brain.
I have the same opinion.
Could you comment on that, Abby? Are we just making kind of metaphors, and are they apt metaphors, and to what degree?
Yeah, I think it's a good metaphor. I mean, certainly you can think of religion as being a meme, which is basically, you know, a non-biological self-replicating entity. I'll put it that way. And seeing religions as memes, I think actually works pretty well. But one advantage that we have is that there's a lot more plasticity around human behavior than there is around genetics, which means we can change religions. And I think that is the thing that many religions, the more conservative religions, hate to think about. They hate to think about the fact that they are human inventions that can be changed. And in fact, if you look into the history of any religion, they have all changed. They pretend that they're dealing in timeless truths, but they're not. Some religions are more honest about, you know, revising their tenets from time to time, and some just totally lie about it. But yeah, religion can be thought of really easily and I think profitably as a meme, but it is a meme that has plasticity. And I think that is something that is useful to think about in the different ways that religions could be changed to perhaps live up to their potential better.
Thank you. That's an interesting response. Karen?
Well, you know, I think this whole issue of a meme is really interesting because I did my dissertation on cultural reproduction. How do cultures reproduce themselves? And okay, this was 40 years ago, so don't ask for a lot of memory. But there was one situation where a group in England had decided that putting kids in order in classes based on their ability, you know, where you had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and the high performers were 7 and the low performers were 1. They decided that wasn't a good idea because it just reinforced itself, right? So on a mental level, they decided that they were going to do away with that. And what happened is when they got in the classroom and mixed everybody up again, they made those same divisions based on how somebody was dressed, the kind of English they used, etc. So there are so many things operating under our radar screen that push us forward. And I think in terms of religion, it's been very successful because it creates community.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of atheists sitting in those pews. And I'll tell you, my sister and I get together, we sing all the Lutheran hymns in a car when we're going somewhere because we memorized them, we love the music, and there's ritual, and ritual's been around for 40, 50,000 years. So it has a lot of tentacles tied to it.
Every time I get frustrated, every time I do something that pisses me off, or every time I try to fix something and it doesn't work, I say, God damn it.
Uh-huh.
Why the hell would I say God damn it? And the only justification I have is that, you know, people raised in Latin countries will say I instead of ow because it's cultural conditioning. And so that's
absolutely.
That's
you cannot go, I don't think you can go, I cannot go a day without saying Jesus Christ. Oh my God. And that's just part of the way my brain works.
And,
you know,
and
if I had to consciously stop doing that, it would take all my power. I would spend all day trying to stop that.
I've tried to correct this. I've tried to replace, you know, God with Crom. And when I was a father of young children, I actually did condition myself for a while that when I would, you know, get angry and normally curse. I remember once upon a time I dropped a brick on my bare foot and the brick hit the corner. The corner of the brick hit my big toe right in the nail and broke the nail. And I remember that I lost the nail. So it was a very, very painful thing. And I remember saying, duckies and bunnies.
I love it.
But it's hard to condition yourself away from that. And I remember Daryl Ray wrote a book about the God virus, and he talked about how religious belief does act as though, I mean, you were talking about a meme before, it does act as though it's a living organism. I mean, there are defense mechanisms that are interconnected through our psyche, so that we don't realize that we are defending the disease that is weakening us.
Good way of putting it.
That's what that is.
Yeah. Any kind of, I think, ideological self-replicator like that has some quality of optimizing around self-replication, right? I mean, that's how natural selection works. And so when you look at Christianity, it to some degree self-replicates by contributing to community, by having pro-social kinds of consequences, by creating a sense of joy and peace or transcendence, or kind of carrying people into a euphoric state. But it also self-replicates by getting people to squander their lives trying to replicate the disease, right? And so because ultimately the religion is kind of agnostic on the question of whether we are happy or not, whether we're flourishing or not. If our suffering advances the ideology, then that works. And if our joy and sense of community advance the ideology, then that's good too.
And either one will reinforce this, because if you have something good going on in your life, well, that's a blessing that has come from God. And if you have a turmoil in your life and you have to suffer through it, well, this also is given as, this is something you must persevere on behalf of your God. So I mean, so somehow being ridiculed and facing adversity is also somehow a reaffirmation of faith. There's no way to falsify this myth.
If I could actually get back to the business of the bad things that happen, as you said, if something good happens, it's a blessing. If something bad happens, you must persevere through it. Or if something bad happens, you must have sinned in some way. And this brings us back to miscarriage, because I actually think that it is cruel when women miscarry and they are told that somehow or another this is their fault, or God was trying to tell them something, or any of these kinds of things. There's plenty of research that shows that basically the female reproductive system is not optimized. It is not good. Nature does not care if an individual lives or dies or suffers or is healthy. What happens in evolution is that enough individuals reproduce that the system keeps going. Basically, for any given adaptation, the standard for success is good enough to not cause death before reproduction too much of the time.
I'm going to give a presentation on this at one point. I'm going to talk about evolution as the cruelest truth, because it's hard, and it would be it's insensitive, and that's actually evil. And just because I may accept evolution as a fact, but that doesn't mean that I justify it as moral. Evolution is the cruelest thing.
No, it is not to be confused with a moral code. People get confused about that. But the female reproductive system is really not optimal. It is marginally adequate. And so when things go wrong in pregnancy, or there is a miscarriage or this kind of thing, I think that it is not only true, but also far less cruel to say, I'm really sorry. The human female reproductive system is not very good. And so, you are suffering from ordinary, normal problems. How can we help you? As opposed to saying, God had a plan. This happened for a reason, or you must have sinned. I mean, those are such lousy things to say to somebody who is suffering from a perfectly ordinary but horrible problem.
I'm betting that you can probably do this off the top of your head, but name 3 improvements to the human reproductive process.
Oh, well, the first one is we could do it kangaroo style. I'll back up a little bit. The problem that human females have is that we walk upright while being very smart. Very smart means that you need to have a big brain, which means you need to have a big head. Walking upright, on the other hand, means that we need to have narrow hips in order to be able to walk. So this is the basic fundamental tension in the human female reproductive system. So if we had been designed like centaurs with 4 legs and 2 hands, let's say you wouldn't want to have hands, then we could have wider hips and those big-headed babies could get through a whole lot more easily. Or we could, if you wanted us to be bipeds, we could do it kangaroo style, where the baby comes out basically as an embryo and continues its development in a nice comfy pouch on the outside of the female's body, where there is a nice nipple for nursing and everything. And if humans had been developed, from a whiteboard with good, sort of optimal engineering in mind, I think we probably would have been given the kangaroo style of reproduction, because we have these big heads and big-headed babies. And it would just be much better if they did most of their development in the pouch outside.
If you look at our ancestral history and just kind of multiply what's estimated to be the kind of traditional rate of maternal mortality times the number of pregnancies women had, about 1/10 of our females during kind of that ancestral period in traditional societies would have died from some consequence of childbearing or childbirth. And until very recently, that was the estimated rate in places like rural Afghanistan, where there was no access to antibiotics, where there was no access to modern medicine. So nature perceives the female body as very expendable, and female vulnerability, social vulnerability, kind of vulnerability to violence during pregnancy, the difficulties that we would have either defending ourselves or gathering sufficient food, and then immediately postpartum, are probably part of the reason that men were able to develop the kinds of patriarchal moral codes that we see in the Bible and Quran, right? Those didn't come out of nowhere. They came out of, I think, our reproductive biology.
Mm-hmm.
So Abby was talking from her PhD, of course, in zoology, and yours, Valerie, is in, what was it, counseling psychology? So you're
That's
talking
right.
about you're talking about more about the focus about getting away from, and I'd like to hear a little bit more from your area of expertise.
Well, with my background in counseling psychology, a part of what I write is focused specifically on the process of recovery from toxic religion, and most specifically, of course, fundamentalist or evangelical forms of Christianity. I tend to use those two words interchangeably, not that everyone who calls themselves evangelical does ascribe to a fundamentalist view of the Bible and a fundamentalist set of doctrinal statements, but most of them do, and frankly, they adopted the term evangelical after the term fundamentalism became toxic. So that's a portion of my focus is on that recovery process, but mostly what I am also working to do is to articulate a point of view about the Bible itself and about women, specifically our role in society, reproductive rights and health, and contraceptive technologies that really do equalize the playing field and allow women to be fully participants in determining the course of our own lives, and full participants in our economy and our political system and our communities. So that's my focus. But over time, of course, that's required me to delve into a number of other arenas as I work to offer those kinds of information and insights to women who are coming out of fundamentalism.
Well, I had a comment about that. You normally, people want to praise religion, but they will comment on anybody else's religion, even the slightly different denomination. That the religion is okay as long as they don't go overboard with it, right? So that when we're looking at other people in other faiths, we'll say that, that if they're not too religious, then it's okay. So basically what we've got is the more religious you are, the worse it is.
Yeah, if it's watered down to the point you can't taste it, then it's not a problem, right?
Exactly. And therein lies the problem. So if religion is just poison, then the only way we can tolerate it is if we dilute it to death, so that it no longer has an adverse effect on us. Well, then why don't we just take that to the next logical level and realize, well, why are we doing this religion thing at all?
It's a great question. I mean, but I think you partially answered it earlier, right? Which is that religion is a whole bunch of different things. It's yes, it's got a lot of poison embedded in it because it anchors us to the worldview and life priorities of our Iron Age ancestors. But as you said, it also creates community, right? And and ritual, and it channels our sense of wonder. It channels our dialogue around what it means to live well and die well, how we create meaning in our lives and purpose in our lives. So I think that, why have religion at all? I think maybe an interesting question is if we're not going to have religions that are based in supernaturalism, superstition, and ancient destructive dogmas that are at odds with what we know about ourselves and the world around us, then what do we replace that with? Should we be thinking about being willing to treat humanism as a kind of, quote, secular religion? And by that, I don't mean any kind of woo. What I do mean is some kind of organized institutional means of coming together around shared values, shared rituals, and shared action.
Let me ask you this then. Do you see a significant similarity between religious belief and a political affiliation? I mean, are they essentially the same thing, or do they work in essentially the same way?
I think, well, increasingly, that's a fascinating question, because increasingly political affiliation in our country is operating more and more, I think, psychologically the way that religions do, right? In that it creates a circumscribed information flow. It creates a set of boundaries around who's perceived as insiders and outsiders, who counts from a moral standpoint, whose well-being, who are my people. So it's become increasingly tribal as I don't think we know exactly what's happening to us in the context of this shift that has been caused by the information age and social media. But something.
Let me explain why I asked the question, and that may direct your answer. Because as an atheist activist, I'm constantly being compared to Stalin, for example. And communists, of course, what they did was they replaced religion with a political affiliation. And living here in Texas, as I do, I've heard from Republican activists both coming to my door and saying that they want me to vote for Republican values. And I've had to tell the canvassers here that we don't associate the word values with Republican anymore, because we just don't see there's a correlation at all. But I've listened to Republicans advocating for education who've had to tell their own congregations that we have to be prepared to vote for people of the other party if we want to preserve education, because they realize that their own party is against education for religious reasons, largely. And here in Texas, people honestly believe that they are born into the Republican Party. You don't hear that from Democrats or from independents, certainly, but the Republicans uniquely think that they're born into that party and that they owe the party some sort of a party loyalty, so that at least the Republican Party, which currently our right wing necessarily, is it has taken the place of religion, and that's why it seems to have adopted religion. And can you comment on that?
Well, as I said, I think increasingly our political parties are operating in similar ways to the way that religion operates. I think that the communism of the Soviet Union and kind of the Marxist purges functioned largely like a godless religion with prophets and, core tenets of faith and blasphemy laws, the whole shtick, right? And more and more what we see is that people on both the right and the far left in the United States are seeming to operate in much the same way. So, I say that as somebody who, last time I was registered with a political party, it was with the Republican Party. I've spent the last 10 years of my life working hard on progressive change and empowering advocacy organizations in Washington State that are working on improving education policy, climate policy, kind of social justice, et cetera. And yet I perceive that what's happening on the far left with, again, is something that's very similar, right? It's very tribal. There are insiders and outsiders. There are blasphemies. There's a kind of closed information loop that becomes self-reinforcing. And without any corrective information, I sometimes analogize it to a severed corpus callosum in a patient, right? Where there's no corrective information flowing from the right to the left brain or vice versa. And what you see then is something that takes on those core attributes of a viral ideology that becomes a force unto itself, a thing that gets preserved at the cost of human well-being.
I'm not as sensitive to the far left here in Texas as I am because
I live in the heart of it, of the kind of left coast, right? So I know I sometimes talk to my friend in Toronto who's like, what the hell are you talking about, right? Here we're just trying to keep kind of, bigots of all kinds from gaining political positions of power and reverting back to institutionalized forms of sexism and racism and homophobia.
I'm not ignorant to the fact that we have a hard left, that I am unapologetically on the left. There's no way I can pretend to be a middle position person. I am definitely on the left. But there are people further left of me that I would like to distinguish myself from. All I'm saying is that living in Texas, I have very little, very little information on them. They don't show up on my radar because almost everything in Texas is owned and controlled by the right.
Mm-hmm.
So yes. that has to be my immediate concern.
Yeah, culture does not evolve in synchronous, right? It's not synchronous evolution. There are changes happening at different paces and in different forms in communities and sub-communities, and I think it's possible to slip into a kind of groupthink ideology. Sometimes that can be quite at odds with the broader culture, right? I mean, the Amish people do that. The Quiverful movement does that, but it can happen in other ways as well.
Increasingly, I'm seeing where it's difficult to distinguish religion from politics because they are so grossly intertwined in this country. And I remember being told that as a child that you don't talk about religion or politics. And what makes these two things you can't discuss? Why are they forbidden to even talk about them? And of course, I had to grow up and realize how irrational they both are. Because if I tell people here in Texas, anywhere really, if I could just get out on the web, like right now, somebody is responding to the fact that I said that I'm on the left, and already they're typing out their comments of hatred. And the reason that I have for saying that I'm on the left is that I care more about human rights than I care about corporate profits. That kind of is what it amounts to for me. And I don't know what being on the left means to somebody else. Maybe they have only some negative experience with some hard left extremists, and so they want to put everybody in a dichotomous illusion, which really doesn't apply either. And I try to think outside of those kind of limitations. But you understand what I'm saying? I mean, when you mention any kind of a political position that you have, especially out on the internet like we are, we're immediately confronted with all kinds of people who hate us for that label without even understanding what we mean by that.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're very right about religion traditional religion is very much intertwined with traditional conservative kind of priorities. If you think about the hierarchy of people that exists in the Bible, you know, it's God over men, over women and children and slaves, all three of those literally being chattel or possessions of men according to the laws in the Old Testament. If you kind of read them not through a modern lens, it's the laws that protect women they're property laws, not human rights laws. And so when you think about the
I
way
can't
that
even
those
get Christians to understand that. It's like they refuse to. It's like I'm not just saying that they ignore the Old Testament. They refuse to read it because there's no other way you can interpret that. It is talking about property.
Oh yeah, and then if you look at how that kind of plays down through history, it's you know, those that kind of patriarchy, it really is the fundamental the fundamental principle underlying those Old Testament laws and underlying, I think, right wing kind of conservative ideology and priorities is might makes right. Right, might makes right. That's why you know, men are over women. Come on, let's get real about that. It's about physical strength. It's about the vulnerability of women during pregnancy, and then how that got encoded in religion and in culture. Why are they more powerful than women? Why are God's chosen people constantly winning battles to show their moral rectitude and their alliance with the holiest of holy beings? It's because might makes right. Right? Why do you have prosperity gospel and unfettered capitalism being supported by people who are conservative Christians? It's because you take what you can, and the fact that you can means that somehow that God is blessing that, and those two ideas of power and moral rectitude get very entangled together on the right.
Yeah, that's a strong point. All right, we normally don't go an hour, more than an hour on this podcast, but having, you know, three guests as I do now, I thought it necessary. I would like to hear closing comments from each of you, and I'm going to try not to interject my own opinions on any of them. So please go ahead.
Well, Valerie's been talking, so Valerie, anything more you wanted to say?
Oh, I don't know. You know, I guess I would comment just that I really appreciated that both you and Karen circled back to these questions of reproduction and gender differences as they relate to reproduction, because I do think that that's very much central to struggles that are going on in our world. And I think it's also central to what Erin Ra mentioned about kind of population pressures and whether we are bumping up even against the sort of limits of our planetary life support system, or whether we're kind of priming ourselves for collapse. Because the reality is that all of that population growth is driven by unsought and often unwanted pregnancy, and that there's no reason to do anything top down or heavy handed if we empower women to have the babies they want when they want to have them. And I would say also, if we empowered men to be able to manage their fertility in a reliable way so that babies were born not because a woman was making the decision or a man was making the decision, but by mutual consent of two people who were contributing DNA to that new being, that our population curve would flatten out and probably kind of stabilize and maybe even decline a bit. So I feel like this is at the heart of a whole bunch of humanity's biggest challenges, whether that's climate change or peacemaking or food and water sufficiency, or simply the ability of people to live lives of their choosing and form families of their choosing and nourish and nurture the children that they want when the time is right.
I want to add something to that. I remember when I was a child, what first time I heard, you know, and I mean, as a little boy, the first time I heard about, you know, the potential calamity of overpopulation, I remember thinking about, well, what if you just had something along the lines of I don't remember what the parallel was in the early 70s, but something along the lines of a reversible vasectomy being performed on every male child instead of a circumcision, which serves no purpose at all and has no justification imaginable, right? Well, what if you did this other thing? And so that, and I was was treated like I was Mengele or something, for such a horrible idea. Well, you're into eugenics. No. Religion is into eugenics, and I can show many examples of this. But what if we had a situation where every pregnancy was not just where it was, as you said, sought, not just not wanted, but actually sought, where you had to consciously decide that you want to get pregnant. So there's no accidental pregnancies occurring at all. What would our population growth be then? Really, would it be half of what it is now, or would it be a quarter of what it is now, or would it be less?
Well, what you're talking about is toggling the default setting on fertility. So kind of flipping the fertility switch to off until people want it on, right? When you talk about that reversible vasectomy. And the very best contraceptives available for women at this point, state-of-the-art IUDs and implants, actually do that. And as a consequence, they drop the unintended pregnancy rate somewhere, some of them 1 in 500, some of them 1 in 2,000. So surprise pregnancy and the need for most abortion actually simply disappears. And I agree, it's interesting that you as a man bring up the question of reversible vasectomy, because I feel like there's a gender justice question around the fact that men don't have similar options, that the best reversible method, reliably reversible method men have has something like a 1 in 10 annual pregnancy rate for couples relying on condoms, and they're like almost a century old. That it's antiquated technology, and you got to roll it on your penis every time you have sex.
The only thing I can say is condoms will make you last longer. There's about the only selling point I can give it.
Yeah, but men deserve better.
Well,
or at least they deserve options.
Okay. And Karen, Abby, did you have any closing comments as well?
I'll let Abby go first.
Okay, well, following on with that, again, looking at the non-supernatural morality, I would posit that sex is a matter of informed consent and that marriage is acknowledged as a human invention. And getting on to what you were saying about population problems and various other ecological problems, I'll say what I said before. We are responsible for figuring things out. No God will save us. And to me, we are responsible for figuring things out means science, but obviously it also means a lot of looking at society, as Valerie was talking about as well.
Well, I just want to thank Valerie and Abby. I've learned a lot more just from this session than I did reading their books and reading the essays. So thank you so much for taking the time. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the name of the book again, which is Women versus Religion, the Case Against Faith and for Freedom. You can pre-order it on Amazon. It comes out June 1st. So get those pre-orders in. Thank you very, very much for having us all on.
We had at least a half a dozen other authors for that book that couldn't be here on the podcast today. Is that right? Is it 6 to 8, something like that?
There are 13. Some of them 13. Couldn't do podcasts, but we're moving them around. We'll try to get everyone on something eventually.
Excellent. All right. Well, everyone, thank you for being on. I'm going to go ahead and close it.
Thanks very much.
And all necessary links will be below.